And I first just wanted to make, before digging into gas specifically, I just wanted to make a few broader comments about energy supply mix to sort of pick up on some of the points that you brought up earlier. Because these are all issues that Ghana has some of these specific issues, but some of these are also broader issues that a number of countries face. And the first one is hydro dependence, at least as sort of the original nucleus of energy. And hydro, of course, has a great thing about it is that the marginal cost of producing hydro is zero or close to zero, right, as long as you've got water behind the dam. But the opportunity cost of hydro is more than zero, right? Because if you use water today, you might not have it tomorrow. So this creates always a political challenge around hydro, which is how fast you draw it down. And so often there's strong incentives to use it very fast because it's cheap, instead of factoring in the opportunity cost of overdrawing the hydro. So that's an issue here, but also that's a more general issue with hydro. Another issue that you pointed out earlier was the challenge that many countries have built out their electricity grids starting with hydro, but then if you grow fast like Ghana, it's very difficult to keep scaling hydro. Because you sort of have what you have, and even if you have a little bit more, it's not easy to scale hydro. And then the final one is that of course you're susceptible to droughts as well. And so that's why a number of countries that are sort of built out their electricity grids on hydro are also, like Ghana, trying to figure out alternatives to supplement. And so Dr. Sando also brought up some of the alternatives. As Todd was mentioning, coal. So I wrote a book about coal that came out recently. Although I like to say I'm not a coal pusher. I'm a coal book pusher. So I push coal books, but coal I'll let people make their own decisions on. But the fact is that so coming back to this basic challenge that we're discussing here about how to, and certainly the focus of the hub, how to expand energy for so basically you want affordable, reliable energy to support job creation, right? And so we heard from Evan certainly about some of the affordability challenges right now with electricity. And so again, that's why a lot of countries have turned towards coal, because coal is cheap, and you can, people are confident that they can get coal imports, relatively inexpensively. That there's a lot of coal available around the world, so that makes it attractive. The other thing that I would say that's almost as important is that the coal value chain is easier to develop than the gas value chain. And so I'll talk in a moment about the challenges of gas to power. But coal, for one thing, you can store it more easily. You can just pile up the coal. I mean, there's some challenges with coal storage too, but basically it's much easier and cheaper than natural gas storage. So I think it's just easier to build out that value chain in addition to being cheap. So that's why a lot of countries are that are looking to really grow their power sectors are looking at coal. Now the downsides of coal, of course we know. So one of them is if you don't control emissions, it is very polluting, right? So that's one strong feeling I would have is. That would be something that, if Ghana does choose to pursue coal, you have to regulate pollution effectively. So you have to make sure that your coal plants have, good controls over, over SOx and NOx and particulates, because otherwise it does create health problems. And so it requires some regulatory capability to make sure people are running the emissions control equipment. And then the last one is, of course, the climate issue. And that's not easy to solve. And again, as Dr. Asando was saying, this is why, especially kind of US and Europe-led multilaterals have said, no, we don't want you to build coal. But, stepping back, again, Ghana can make decisions for Ghana, right? And so this is what you have to weigh. I mean, that you have to weigh this challenge of, what are our paths to getting this affordable, available energy for job creation? So, yeah, so that's sort of the coal picture. So now I'll come to gas. And I thought, again, as we heard this morning, Ghana has, a moderate amount of gas, for sure, but not an unlimited amount of gas, so not as big as certain other places. So I think it's very understandable to want to have gas play a larger role in the domestic energy mix, but also, in a way, it's sort of a good thing that I think you realize going in that this isn't going to be able to support all of Ghana's growth, just with domestic gas. And in some ways, as I'll come back to, that might seem like a disadvantage, but in certain respects, knowing that actually could help you in how you develop the gas market. So I'll talk more about that. Okay, so the next thing that I want to discuss is why is natural gas especially hard to develop the value chain? So there are a few reasons. So one of the most important is that gas transportation and distribution infrastructure is very expensive. So gas pipelines are very expensive. LNG is very expensive. If you build a liquefaction terminal and LNG tankers and regasification on the other end. So big international projects like that are multi-billion-dollar projects. But it's even expensive, building out kind of domestic pipelines, domestic gas distribution. So that's kind of the first factor that's important about gas. The second factor, as I already mentioned, is that that it's not cheaply storable. So for sure, you can have, there are plenty of gas storage facilities around the world, but it's expensive. So what those factors mean is that developing the gas value chain is hard. Because, so from, thinking about the upstream, right? So if you think about the gas producer who wants to develop the field, and then you think on the other end that there's a gas consumer that would like to use gas, and they'd like to have that be as affordable and available as possible. And in between, there's this very expensive transportation that you have to build. So what it's meant in practice is that these kinds of big sort of gas value chains take a lot of coordination of investment, right? So because they're just so expensive that everybody's kind of worried. On the upstream, they're sort of worried, well, what if I develop this gas field and there's no customer, on the other end who's going to pay me enough money, to recover all the costs of the transportation infrastructure. On the customer side, people worry about, well, what if I build my, gas-fired power plant or a gas-fired industrial facility and no gas comes through the pipeline, right? Which has happened in a lot of places. So that happened in India, right? They built this big pipeline. There were a lot of, industrial facilities built to use the gas, and there were severe sort of shortages of the gas, right? So these are the things that make gas kind of uniquely challenging. And so then, looking at it from the perspective of, there could be a lot of benefits for Ghana or for other countries to develop their domestic gas for, especially for domestic uses. There are a lot of industries, that can use gas as a feedstock. You can use gas for power. You can use gas for industrial heating, for residential heating, for transportation. The challenge ends up being, and so a lot of countries, Nigeria is a great example where they have a lot more gas resource than Ghana does, but they've really struggled to develop it for domestic use. Even though they could, their power sector is very unreliable. There are a lot of industries that could use it. but they've struggled to because they just can't, create an environment where, that will bring the investment in, to support that development of domestic sort of gas transportation infrastructure. So this is sort of just a challenge to bear in mind, is that even if you know that this would be great for the country, we could use all this gas, the value, as Dr. Isondo was saying, the value we would get from the downstream, from our industries would more than justify the cost of developing all this infrastructure. It's just, in a practical sense, it's just hard, figuring out ways to stimulate that growth of domestic markets. And especially because from the gas producer perspective, an oil company, they'll look at it and they'll say, well, we can develop gas for domestic use, and then we have to be sure that we have sectors that'll pay enough money, we have to really coordinate that value chain. Or they can just say, well, we'll develop into this, like in Nigeria, we'll develop gas for export as LNG. And from the gas producer perspective, they just look at that and they say, much lower risk, much higher return for exports. So again, that's not necessarily saying that that's the best added value for the country, but it's just much easier to do, in sort of practical terms. So this is kind of a challenge with gas. Then the gas to power piece in particular, it has the additional challenge that in many countries there are these sorts of issues that Eben was talking about with are we able to collect enough from our customers, and especially if it's residential customers. And this, again, as we talked about in Abuja, is a particular problem in Nigeria, where a very high percentage of their electricity use goes to residential customers as opposed to industry. So it's very difficult to develop gas because they have difficulty both how their electricity is priced and how well they can collect from customers. They just have difficulty creating any kind of certainty that there will be enough revenue to stimulate that domestic gas investment. And this, again, this is true, this isn't just Nigeria or Ghana. I mean, these are challenges for almost all countries that have a big domestic gas resource and kind of want to develop it at home. So these are the challenges of gas. As to it, So what are some approaches to try to still stimulate domestic gas use, even in the face of these challenges? And so the first one that I would say is very much the strategy that Ghana used to first develop its electricity supply industry, which is industrial anchor customers, right? So Valco is one of the best examples ever of huge industrial customer. And then that helps you finance the development of the dam in that case, right? And so that's a great way, to start to build out electricity markets, but also that's very much true for gas markets, because often you'll have, a number of gas-using industries. They might be less price sensitive than if the gas is going into power, and especially if the gas is going into sort of industrial or residential power, where people are very price sensitive. Although I was also very interested to hear how high priced electricity prices are in Ghana. Clearly that's a challenge for industrial customers too, to pay such high tariffs. So I think that's one important strategy, is as much as you can find some more industrial customers for gas. So this can be gas for process heating. It can be gas as a petrochemical feedstock or an agricultural or fertilizer feedstock. And it could be various other things. So many countries have used that as an effective strategy to sort of. And so then once you start to develop a value chain, with these sort of anchor customers, you're building infrastructure that then is just useful for anyone who wants to use gas. So the second point is, from the industry perspective, the most important thing for them is going to be the certainty and reliability that if they build something designed to use gas, that there will be gas, right? So avoiding this problem in India where so many industries got burned, around that pipeline. So this is sort of my second point, is to make sure that if you're developing a gas to whatever value chain, that the user, like industrial users, if they're the anchor customers, that there's some tier in the market where people can get unlimited access to gas. Might be at a high price, but at least they know they can get it, because that certainty is going to be really important, for any gas-using industry. So how do you do that? And because of these things that we talked about, because gas isn't very easy to store, because it has this value chain issue, it's not very easy to do if you're only depending on domestic sources. And so that's why I like the idea of building, even if you have domestic gas, of also building gas import facilities, right? And so, of course, there's the West African gas pipeline, which has had problems. But one nice thing today is the LNG market is so deep and kind of diverse that and it's relatively inexpensive. You can have a floating regasification and storage unit, or you could build fixed regasification facilities. But I think that's worked well in a number of countries, to make sure, okay, we're going to have imports, so at least if we build out domestic industries, they know there's some source of gas. And so, one country that's obviously very different, much bigger gas production, just much bigger economy is China, right? So China has built out, gas infrastructure from all sources it can. So China has onshore gas in the west. I think they have pipeline imports from Turkmenistan. They built a big west-east pipeline, across the country. They have some offshore gas, but they've also built a ton of LNG import facilities, right? And so this makes sure that, okay, we just know that we're always going to have gas, and because of these challenges about gas markets, I think this can be very helpful. So it's counterintuitive, because you might sort of think, well, we have domestic gas, why do we want, because imports are likely to be expensive. LNG, shipment probably usually adds $4 to $5 per million BTU, so it's not going to be cheap, but at least it's there. Same thing with India. So India's built a lot of LNG imports, so industries that really want reliability, they can get it. So another thing I won't say a lot about, but sometimes I think it's overrated, the conflict between export use and industrial use. Ghana, yes, there is some limited availability of domestic gas, but a number of countries, in building out exports, it's also helped, catalyze growth in domestic use as well, because you're starting to build infrastructure where you could cross-subsidize, you could have things where you tell gas producers, well, you can build it for exports, but a certain amount of the gas, you'll kind of cross-subsidize from exports to put in the domestic market. And then just my last point is just in thinking specifically about the gas to power value chain, to not worry so much. People think a lot about, oh, we've got to have sort of a best practices electricity market where we have, competitive short-term bidding and all that kind of thing. And so the way I would think about it instead is to build out a chain that's viable and robust. What you really need is to link it through forward contracts. So the first step that you have to have viable sort of cost recovery on electricity, which is not easy, but you can't build, that's the downstream, so you have to have that before. But once you have that, then the way it can work is, okay, basically that makes the electricity distribution companies, so if they're financially viable, and it was good to hear Ghana sort of experimenting in alternative models. So if your distribution company is viable, well then they can create a forward contract with the generating company, right? And so that forward contract is what enables the generating company to finance new power plants. Then and then so that the generating company gets enough revenue for the distribution company. Then the generating company is financially viable, so they can get long-term contracts for gas supply, right? And so then that enables the gas supplier, to be able to finance this gas distribution network, and then they're financially viable. They can get long-term contracts for gas procurement from the gas producers, right? And that's what lets the gas producers have this confidence to say, okay, I know this is expensive, but I have a long-term contract, I'm going to develop this field, I'm going to build the transportation. So that's sort of my final thought, is instead of getting too wrapped up in short-term pricing of everything, to think about, well, can you create this long-term contracting framework, that lets you sort of stitch the pieces of the value chain together in a financially viable way. So, yeah.
Thank you.